Listen, and let yourself drift into a world where the horizon stretches endlessly in all directions, where the wind carries stories older than memory across grasslands that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Tonight, we journey to the 13th century, to a land where the sky touches the earth in an unbroken circle, where the scent of horse leather mingles with the sweet fragrance of wild herbs, and where the sound of hoofbeats on ancient earth echoes like a heartbeat across time itself. Here, beneath the eternal blue sky that the Mongols called Tengri, a story begins that will reshape not just a continent, but the very nature of human civilization. It is a tale that starts with a single child, born into a world of bitter cold and endless struggle, yet destined to unite fractured tribes into the largest contiguous empire the world has ever known. Let the gentle rhythm of this ancient story carry you into peaceful sleep, as we follow the extraordinary journey of a boy named Temujin, who would become known to history as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler whose legacy still whispers through the wind across the steppes of Mongolia, reminding us that even the most humble beginnings can give birth to transformations that echo through eternity. In the beginning, according to the ancient songs of the Mongol people, there was Berta Chino, the blue wolf, whose coat shimmered like twilight across the endless steppes. He came from the realm of eternal sky, carrying within his spirit the fierce independence and boundless energy that would one day define an entire civilization. His mate was Kwai Maral, the beautiful doe, graceful and swift, whose wisdom ran as deep as the hidden springs that nourish the grasslands even in the driest seasons. From their union, so the storytellers tell us, came the first of the Mongol people, born under the vast dome of heaven that stretches without boundary from horizon to horizon. This is not merely mythology, but the foundational truth that shaped every aspect of Mongol understanding. That they were children of the sky itself, inheritors of a divine mandate that connected them to the cosmic order of the universe. Imagine yourself standing on those ancient steps, where the grass waves in patterns that seem to mirror the movements of clouds above, where the wind carries the scent of distant snow and the warmth of sun-baked earth. This is a landscape that teaches patience and resilience, where survival depends not on the accumulation of possessions, but on the ability to read the subtle signs of weather and season, to move with the rhythms of nature rather than against them. The shamans of the Mongol tribes understood this connection between earth and sky as a living reality. They would climb to the highest peaks, where the air grows thin and the spirit world seems to press close against the physical realm, there to commune with Tengri, the eternal blue sky that governed all existence. In their understanding, the universe was not a collection of separate objects, but a single, interconnected web of energy and consciousness, where every action rippled outward like waves on a still pond. This spiritual foundation would prove crucial to understanding the man who would one day unite these scattered tribes. For Temujin, the future Genghis Khan, was raised in a world where the divine and the mundane intertwined with every breath, where the movement of clouds could foretell the outcome of battles, and where the cry of an eagle might carry messages from the ancestors who had gone before. The harsh beauty of the Mongolian landscape shaped not just the physical bodies of its people, but their souls as well. Winters here could freeze the breath in a man's lungs, while summers brought heat that shimmered like liquid silver above the grasslands. The people learned to bend without breaking, to find strength in flexibility, to see opportunity in apparent disaster. These lessons, learned in childhood around the warm fires of felt tents, would later enable them to adapt to the governance of sedentary civilizations thousands of miles from their homeland. The Mongol creation stories speak of a time when the world was young and malleable, when the boundaries between the possible and impossible had not yet hardened into rigid categories. In this mythic time, heroes could speak with animals, shamans could travel between worlds, and the very landscape itself might shift and change in response to human need and divine will. These stories were not mere entertainment, but teaching tools that prepared young minds to envision possibilities beyond the constraints of ordinary experience. Within this rich tapestry of myth and spiritual understanding, certain themes emerged that would later manifest in the empire that Temujin would build. The concept of universal rulership, the idea that true leadership must serve the harmony of the cosmic order, the belief that diversity of peoples and customs could be unified under a single, overarching vision. All these principles were already present in the ancient wisdom of the steppe peoples. The blue wolf and the beautiful doe represented more than just the ancestors of the Mongol people. They symbolized the perfect balance between fierce independence and graceful adaptation, between the warrior spirit that could conquer worlds. Their mythic union suggested that true strength came not from domination, but from the harmonious integration of complementary forces. As the ancient stories tell us, the children of the blue wolf inherited not just the fierce courage of their ancestor, but also his restless spirit, his need to roam beyond the familiar boundaries of home territory. This wanderlust, this drive to explore and discover, would eventually carry Mongol influence from the shores of the Pacific to the gates of Vienna, creating connections between civilizations that had never before imagined each other's existence. The shamanic traditions that nurtured these mythic understandings also fostered a remarkable tolerance for different ways of seeing the world. Since the spirit realm was understood to be vast and multifaceted, it made sense that different peoples might approach the divine through different rituals and beliefs. This spiritual open-mindedness would later translate into the remarkable religious tolerance that characterized Mongol rule, allowing Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and traditional shamans to coexist peacefully within the same empire. And so, in the swirling mists of legend and the solid realities of steppe life, the stage was set for the emergence of a leader who would embody both the mythic possibilities of the blue wolf and the practical necessities of survival in one of the world's most challenging environments, preparing us for the story of a boy who would be born into this rich confluence of spiritual vision and earthly struggle. Around the year 1162, when the grasslands lay thick with summer growth and the herds grew fat on the abundant pasture, a child was born who would change the world. The infant arrived clutching a clot of blood in his tiny fist, a sign that the shamans interpreted as a portent of great battles to come. His father, Yasuge, was a minor chieftain of the Bohigan clan, a man respected for his skill with horses and his ability to navigate the complex web of tribal politics that governed life on the steppes. The child was named Temujin, after a Tatar warrior whom his father had recently defeated in battle. This practice of naming children after conquered enemies was typical of the Mongol tradition of absorbing the strength of the defeated, transforming conflict into a form of spiritual incorporation. From his earliest days then, Temujin carried within his very name the seed of his future destiny as a unifier of peoples. The Mongolia of Temujin's childhood was a land of breathtaking beauty and relentless hardship. Picture, if you will, a landscape where the sky dominates everything, stretching from horizon to horizon in an unbroken dome of blue, so vast it seems to curve visibly at the edges. Below this celestial canopy, the grasslands roll in gentle swells like a green ocean, broken occasionally by rocky outcroppings that serve as landmarks for the nomadic herders who follow their flocks across these endless expanses. In winter, this same landscape transforms into a realm of bitter cold and driving snow, where the wind cuts through even the thickest felt clothing, and the very air seems to freeze in crystalline patterns. The Mongols called these winter winds dudes, and they could kill entire herds in a single night, reducing wealthy families to desperate poverty before the spring thaw. It was in this harsh environment that Temujin learned the fundamental lessons that would shape his character: that survival depends on adaptability, that strength comes from unity, and that the difference between life and death often hangs on the smallest details of preparation and foresight. The boy's early years were spent in the traditional manner of nomadic children, learning to ride almost before he could walk, developing the deep connection between human and horse that formed the foundation of Mongol culture. These were not mere riding lessons, but an education in a way of life that had persisted for centuries, where the movements of the herds determined the rhythms of existence, where the ability to read the subtle signs of weather and grass could mean the difference between prosperity and starvation. Within the warm confines of the family's ger, the traditional felt tent that served as home, young Temujin absorbed the oral traditions of his people. The long winter evenings were filled with stories of heroic ancestors, of great migrations across the steppes, of the eternal struggle between order and chaos that shaped the Mongol understanding of existence. These stories were not mere entertainment, but a form of education that prepared young minds to understand their place in the cosmic order, their responsibilities to clan and tribe, and their potential for greatness. The social structure of Mongol society was both rigidly hierarchical and surprisingly fluid. While birth determined one's initial position within the clan, merit and achievement could elevate individuals to positions of great influence. Temujin observed how his father navigated these complex relationships, forming alliances with some clans while maintaining careful distance from others, always aware that the balance of power could shift with the changing seasons. This delicate political equilibrium was shattered when Temujin was only 9 years old. Yasuge, while traveling to arrange his son's future marriage, was invited to share a meal with a group of Tatar tribesmen. The Tatars, remembering old grievances against the Borjigin clan, secretly poisoned Yasuge's food. The chieftain managed to return home, but he died within days, leaving his young son to witness the cruel realities of steppe politics. The death of Yasuge marked the beginning of the most difficult period of Temujin's life. Without a strong leader to protect them, the family was quickly abandoned by their tribal allies. The Taichud clan, who had previously sworn loyalty to Yasuge, now refused to acknowledge his young son's authority. They departed with most of the family's herds, leaving Temujin, his mother Hoelun, and his younger siblings to face the approaching winter with barely enough resources to survive. Hoelun, whose name means rainbow, proved to be a woman of extraordinary strength and determination. She gathered her children around her and declared that they would not submit to the charity of their former allies, but would survive through their own efforts. This decision marked the beginning of a period of hardship that would forge Temujin's character like iron in a forge, teaching him lessons about loyalty, betrayal, and the absolute necessity of self-reliance. The family was forced to abandon the traditional lifestyle of herders and become foragers, searching the grasslands for edible roots and berries, fishing in the cold streams that cut through the steppes, hunting small game with makeshift weapons. Temujin learned to set traps for marmots and field mice, to identify the plants that could sustain life and avoid those that brought death. These skills, learned in desperation, would later serve him well in his campaigns of conquest, where the ability to live off the land often meant the difference between victory and defeat. During this period of exile and poverty, Temujin's relationship with his half-brother Beka became increasingly strained. The competition for scarce resources brought out the worst in both boys, culminating in a conflict over a fish and a bird that Beka had claimed for himself. In a moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life, Temujin and his full brother Kasar killed Beta with arrows, an act that revealed the iron determination that lay beneath the surface of the future conqueror. The murder of Beta brought swift retribution from the Taichiud clan, who saw it as an opportunity to eliminate a potential threat to their own authority. They captured Temujin and subjected him to the humiliation of the Kanga, a wooden collar that marked him as a prisoner and prevented him from lifting his hands to his head. For months he was passed from camp to camp, a living reminder of his family's fall from grace. Yet, even in captivity, Temujin's extraordinary character began to manifest itself. He observed everything around him, learning about the strengths and weaknesses of his captors, winning the sympathy of some through his quiet dignity and courage. When the opportunity finally came for escape, during a festival when his guards were distracted by celebration, he seized it with the decisive action that would characterize his entire career. The escape from the Taichiud marked the end of Temujin's childhood and the beginning of his transformation into the leader who would unite the Mongol tribes. The lessons learned during those years of hardship, the importance of loyal allies, the necessity of strong leadership, the value of merit over birth, would become the founding principles of the empire he would build, transforming personal suffering into universal wisdom. In the traditional culture of the Mongol steppes, few bonds were considered more sacred than that between Anda, sworn brothers who had pledged their lives to each other beneath the eternal blue sky. It was such a bond that developed between the young Temujin and Jamuka, a boy from the Jadaran clan who seemed destined to become his closest companion and, ultimately, his greatest rival. Their friendship began in the innocent days of childhood, when the future seemed as limitless as the grasslands themselves. Picture two boys racing their ponies across the steppes, their laughter carried by the wind, their young faces bright with the joy of competition and companionship. They would hunt together, practice archery together, and share their dreams of the future around the flickering flames of their campfires. In those golden moments, the political divisions that separated their clans seemed as insubstantial as morning mist. The ritual of Anda was more than mere friendship. It was a spiritual union that bound two souls together across lifetimes. Temujin and Jamuka performed this ceremony twice, first as children and later as young men, each time exchanging gifts that symbolized their commitment to each other's welfare. They shared arrowheads and deer knuckles, modest tokens that carried the weight of sacred promise. In their youthful idealism, they believed that such bonds could transcend the petty jealousies and political calculations that had divided the Mongol tribes for generations. Yet, even in those early days, careful observers might have noticed the fundamental differences in their characters and visions. Jamuka, whose name meant iron cooking pot, was a traditionalist who believed firmly in the ancient hierarchies of steppe society. He accepted without question that leadership belonged to those of noble birth, that the established order of clans and tribes reflected the will of Tengri, the eternal sky. His charisma was undeniable, his skill in battle impressive, but his imagination was bounded by the conventions of his ancestors. Temujin, by contrast, had learned from his years of hardship that traditional structures could be as fragile as spring ice. He had seen how quickly wealth could turn to poverty, how swiftly allies could become enemies, how the accident of birth meant nothing when survival was at stake. These experiences had planted in his mind the revolutionary idea that loyalty should be earned through merit rather than inherited through blood, that the strongest social bonds were those forged in the crucible of shared struggle rather than the comfortable certainties of inherited privilege. The first test of their brotherhood came when Temujin reached the age to claim his promised bride, Berta of the Konkirat tribe. This marriage had been arranged by his father before his death, and it represented not just personal fulfillment, but political alliance, a chance to rebuild the influence that the family had lost during their years of exile. The young woman who awaited him was said to be intelligent and strong-willed, qualities that would prove essential in the challenging life that lay ahead. The wedding ceremony took place in the traditional manner, with both families contributing to a feast that celebrated not just the union of two individuals, but the binding together of two lineages. Berthe came with a dowry that included a magnificent sable coat, a garment of such quality that it spoke of her family's prosperity and their confidence in Temujin's future prospects. For the young man who had spent years wearing the rough felt of poverty, this gift must have seemed like a sign from heaven that his fortunes were finally turning. The happiness of the newlyweds was brief, shattered by an attack that would test every lesson Temujin had learned about loyalty, strategy, and the brutal realities of steppe warfare. The Merkits, seeking revenge for an old grievance against Temujin's father, descended upon the newlyweds camp like wolves on a sheepfold. In the chaos of the nighttime raid, Berthe was captured and carried away, leaving Temujin with a choice that would define his character for the rest of his life. Lesser men might have accepted this loss as the price of their weakness, might have sought new alliances and abandoned the woman who had been taken from them. But Temujin's response revealed the depths of his determination and the growing sophistication of his strategic thinking. He understood that this was not merely a personal tragedy, but a test of his leadership, a challenge that would determine whether he could protect those who depended on him. The rescue of Berthe required allies, and Temujin swallowed his pride to seek help from those who had previously rejected him. He appealed to Togrul, the powerful Khan of the Khanates, who had been his father's ally in better times. More importantly, he turned to Jamuka, his sworn brother, asking him to honor their sacred bond by joining the campaign to recover his wife. The alliance that formed around this rescue mission was a preview of the coalition building skills that would later enable Temujin to unite the Mongol tribes. Jamuka contributed his own warriors, while Togrul provided the bulk of the force needed to challenge the Merkits in their stronghold. The campaign itself was a masterpiece of steppe warfare, combining the speed and mobility of mounted archers with the kind of detailed intelligence gathering that would become a hallmark of Mongol military strategy. The successful rescue of Berthe was more than a personal victory. It was a demonstration of Temujin's growing ability to inspire loyalty and coordinate complex military operations. The young woman who returned to her husband had been changed by her ordeal, pregnant with a child whose paternity would remain forever uncertain. Yet Temujin's acceptance of both wife and child revealed the generous spirit that would later enable him to incorporate defeated enemies into his own forces, transforming conquest into unity. The aftermath of the rescue marked the beginning of a subtle shift in the relationship between the two sworn brothers. Success had enhanced Temujin's reputation and attracted new followers to his banner, while the campaign had revealed his superior skills as a military strategist and coalition builder. Jamuka, despite his crucial role in the victory, found himself increasingly overshadowed by his friend's growing influence and charisma. The tension between them crystallized around a seemingly trivial incident during their return journey. When it came time to make camp, Jamuka suggested that they pitch their tents together, as befitted sworn brothers. But Temujin, perhaps sensing the growing strain in their relationship, or perhaps already beginning to envision a future where their paths would diverge, chose instead to camp separately. This small act of independence was the first crack in a friendship that had once seemed unbreakable. The gradual dissolution of their brotherhood was not marked by dramatic confrontation, but by the slow accumulation of small disagreements and competing loyalties. Jamuka attracted followers who believed in the traditional order of steppe society, while Temujin drew those who had been marginalized by that same system. The poor, the dispossessed, the talented individuals whose abilities had been overlooked by the established hierarchy. Each man was building the foundation for the future he envisioned, and those visions were increasingly incompatible. The final break came when both men were acclaimed as Khan by their respective followers, a development that made their rivalry official and inevitable. The steppes, they realized, were not large enough for two men who both claimed universal authority. The friendship that had begun with such promise now stood revealed as a preparation for the ultimate test of their different philosophies, setting the stage for the Great Consolidation that would determine the future of the Mongol people. The transformation of Temujin from a tribal leader into the great Khan of all the Mongols was not achieved through a single dramatic victory, but through decades of patient coalition building, strategic brilliance, and an almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty among those who had been forgotten by the traditional power structures of steppe society. This period of consolidation, spanning roughly from 1190 to 1206, represents one of the most remarkable examples of political and military genius in human history. The Mongolia of the late 12th century was a patchwork of competing tribes, each fiercely independent, each jealously guarding its own traditions and territories. The Merkits controlled the forests to the north, the Naimans dominated the western steppes, the Tatars held sway in the east, and dozens of smaller clans maintained their own spheres of influence throughout the vast grasslands. These tribes had warred against each other for generations, their conflicts creating a complex web of alliances and grievances that seemed to make any lasting unity impossible. Yet Temujin possessed a vision that transcended these ancient divisions. He saw beyond the immediate concerns of tribal rivalry to a larger possibility: the creation of a unified Mongol nation that could harness the combined strength of all the steppe peoples. This vision was not merely political, but spiritual, rooted in his understanding of the Mongol connection to Tengri, the eternal blue sky that stretched over all their lands without regard for tribal boundaries. The foundation of Temujin's military success lay in his revolutionary approach to warfare and organization. Where traditional steppe armies were essentially loose confederations of tribal warriors, each fighting under their own leaders and following their own customs, Temujin created a disciplined force organized along decimal lines. His army was divided into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, each commanded by officers chosen for their ability rather than their birth. This system, simple in concept but revolutionary in practice, allowed for unprecedented coordination and flexibility in battle. The psychological dimensions of his military strategy were equally innovative. Temujin understood that the reputation of an army could be as powerful as its actual strength, and he carefully cultivated an image of invincibility that often caused enemies to surrender without fighting. His intelligence networks, staffed by merchants, shamans, and diplomatic envoys, provided him with detailed information about enemy movements, internal divisions, and potential weaknesses. Often, he would know more about his opponent's plans than they knew about his own. The campaign against the Merkits demonstrated these principles in action. Rather than launching a direct assault on their strongholds, Temujin spent months gathering intelligence about their leadership, their military capabilities, and their relationships with other tribes. He learned that the Merkits were divided among themselves, with some clans more committed to the war than others. Using this knowledge, he was able to isolate the most dangerous enemies while offering generous terms to those willing to submit. The actual battle, when it came, was a masterpiece of coordination and timing. Temujin's forces struck simultaneously from multiple directions, creating confusion and panic among the Merkits, while preventing any organized resistance. The defeated warriors were not executed or enslaved, as was traditional, but were offered the chance to join the victorious army. bringing their skills and local knowledge to strengthen the growing confederation. This pattern of conquest and incorporation became the template for all of Temujin's subsequent campaigns. Each victory not only eliminated a rival, but also added new warriors, new skills, and new perspectives to his growing army. The Chinese engineers who joined his forces brought knowledge of siege warfare and fortification. The Khitan administrators contributed their expertise in record-keeping and taxation. The Western merchants provided connections to trade networks that stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. The war against the Tatars presented a different kind of challenge, one that tested not just Temujin's military skills, but his ability to balance justice with pragmatism. The Tatars were the people who had poisoned his father, and traditional honor demanded complete revenge. Yet Temujin recognized that the wholesale slaughter of the Tatars would eliminate valuable human resources and create a precedent that might encourage futile resistance from other tribes. His solution was characteristically innovative. The Tatar leadership was indeed executed, fulfilling the demands of justice and honor. But the common warriors and their families were absorbed into the Mongol Confederation, their children raised as Mongols and given the same opportunities for advancement as any other members of the growing nation. This policy of selective mercy and strategic incorporation became one of the defining characteristics of Mongol expansion, allowing them to transform enemies into allies and maintain their strength even while suffering the casualties inevitable in continuous warfare. The complexity of these campaigns can be seen in the protracted struggle against the Naimans, who represented perhaps the most sophisticated military challenge that Temujin faced during the consolidation period. The Naimans possessed advanced metallurgy, producing superior weapons and armor. Their leader, Tayang Khan, was an experienced commander who understood the importance of intelligence and deception. Most significantly, they had access to Chinese military advisors who brought knowledge of tactics and strategy that had been developed over centuries of warfare. The decisive battle against the Naimans took place at Chakimaut, where Temujin demonstrated his mastery of psychological warfare. Knowing that the enemy was monitoring his movements, he ordered his forces to light an unusually large number of campfires, creating the impression that his army was much larger than it actually was. The deception worked perfectly, causing the Naimans to delay their attack while they sought reinforcements, giving Temujin the time he needed to maneuver his forces into the most advantageous position. The victory at Chakimaut was more than a military triumph. It was a demonstration of the superiority of Temujin's organizational system over traditional steppe warfare. The Naiman army, despite its individual excellence, could not match the coordination and flexibility of the Mongol decimal system. The battle also marked the capture of Tata Tonga, the Naiman scribe who would later adapt the Uyghur alphabet for writing the Mongol language, creating the literary foundation for the empire's administrative system. Throughout these campaigns, Temujin's greatest advantage was his ability to inspire absolute loyalty among his followers. This loyalty was not based on fear or ethnic solidarity alone, but on a genuine belief that he represented a new form of leadership that could transcend the limitations of traditional tribal society. His followers saw him not just as a successful war leader, but as a man who could create a just society where advancement was based on merit rather than birth, where the talents of all people could be recognized and rewarded. The final phase of the consolidation period involved the climactic struggle with Jamukha, the sworn brother who had become his most dangerous rival. This conflict was more than a personal rivalry. It represented a fundamental clash between two different visions of Mongol society. Jamukha appealed to the traditional aristocracy, promising to maintain the ancient hierarchies and privileges that had governed steppe society for generations. Temujin, in contrast, offered a meritocratic alternative that threatened to overturn the established order. The decisive confrontation came not through a single great battle, but through a series of smaller engagements that gradually eroded Jamukha's support. Temujin's superior organization and his policy of generous treatment for defeated enemies slowly drew away Jamukha's allies, until the once powerful leader found himself isolated and betrayed by his own subordinates. The manner of Jamukha's death, executed by his own followers and delivered to Temujin as a token of submission, symbolized the collapse of the old order and the triumph of the new. The consolidation of the Mongol tribes represented more than a military achievement. It was a social revolution that transformed the entire structure of steppe society. The rigid hierarchies based on birth and tribal affiliation were replaced by a fluid system that rewarded talent and loyalty. The narrow loyalties of clan and tribe were expanded to encompass a broader Mongol identity that could eventually embrace peoples from across the Eurasian continent. Most importantly, the destructive cycle of intertribal warfare was broken, allowing the creative energies of the Mongol people to be directed outward toward the conquest and transformation of the sedentary world. As the year 1206 approached, Temujin stood on the threshold of a transformation that would change not just his own life, but the course of world history. The tribal chieftain who had once foraged for roots and berries was about to become the Great Khan of a unified Mongol nation, ready to launch the campaigns that would create the largest contiguous empire in human history. The stage was set for the Great Assembly that would formalize this transformation and launch the Mongol expansion that would reshape the medieval world. In the spring of 1206, as the harsh Mongolian winter released its grip on the steppes, and the first green shoots of grass began to emerge from the thawing earth, representatives from all the Mongol tribes gathered for a Kurultai that would change the course of world history. This was not merely a political assembly, but a sacred ceremony that would formalize the transformation of Temujin from a tribal leader into Genghis Khan, the Great Khan of all the Mongols, the ruler whose authority would eventually stretch from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna. The gathering took place at the source of the Onon River, a location chosen not only for its practical advantages, abundant water and grazing for the thousands of horses that accompanied the delegates. This was sacred ground, where the shamans could most easily commune with Tengri, the eternal blue sky, and where the ancestors of the Mongol people could witness the momentous events that were about to unfold. Imagine, if you will, the scene that greeted visitors as they approached this historic assembly. The landscape was transformed into a temporary city of felt tents, their white surfaces gleaming in the spring sunlight like stars scattered across the green expanse of the steppes. The air was filled with the sounds of thousands of horses, their nickering and stamping creating a constant background rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the earth itself. Smoke from countless cooking fires rose in straight columns toward the sky, carrying the scent of roasted meat and fermented mare's milk that would nourish the delegates during their deliberations. The formal ceremonies began with the ritual purification of the assembled leaders, a process that involved passing between fires while shamans chanted prayers to cleanse away the spiritual impurities that might interfere with the sacred work ahead. The 9 yak-tail standard, the white banner that symbolized the unity of the Mongol people, was raised on a hill overlooking the assembly, its streamers catching the wind and seeming to dance with joy at the prospect of the great changes to come. The proclamation of Temujin as Genghis Khan was more than a political ceremony. It was a spiritual transformation that elevated him from mortal leadership to divine authority. The shamans declared that his new title meant universal ruler, a designation that carried with it the responsibility to govern not just the Mongol tribes, but potentially all the peoples of the earth. This was not mere grandiosity, but a reflection of the Mongol understanding that true leadership must serve the cosmic order, harmonizing the earthly realm with the will of heaven. The organizational genius that would characterize the Mongol Empire was evident from the very beginning of Genghis Khan's reign. The decimal system that he had used to structure his army was now extended to encompass the entire Mongol nation, creating a framework for administration that could expand to accommodate any number of peoples and territories. Every 10 families were grouped under a single leader, every 100 families under a higher commander, and so on up the hierarchy to the level of the Tumen, the 10,000-man unit that would become the backbone of Mongol military organization. This system was revolutionary not just in its mathematical precision, but in its meritocratic principles. Traditional tribal hierarchies were abolished, replaced by a structure where advancement depended on ability, loyalty, and achievement, rather than birth or clan affiliation. The son of a herder could rise to command a Tumen if he demonstrated the necessary skills, while the heir of a great family might find himself serving under a more capable leader from humble origins. The religious tolerance that would become one of the defining characteristics of the Mongol Empire was established at this founding ceremony. Genghis Khan declared that while he personally honored Tengri and the traditional shamanic practices of his people, his empire would welcome all faiths and protect all believers. This policy was not merely pragmatic, though it certainly helped to reduce resistance in conquered territories, but reflected a genuine spiritual understanding that the divine could be approached through many different paths. The legal code that Genghis Khan promulgated at the Great Assembly represented another revolutionary innovation. Known as the Yasa, this body of laws applied equally to all members of the Mongol Confederation, regardless of their tribal origin or social status. The code emphasized practical justice over traditional privilege, establishing severe punishments for theft, adultery, and betrayal while protecting the rights of widows, orphans, and religious minorities. Most significantly, it institutionalized the meritocratic principles that had enabled Genghis Khan to rise from obscurity to supreme power. The military reforms announced at the Kurultai would transform the nature of warfare itself. The old system of tribal levies, where warriors fought primarily for their own clan leaders, was replaced by a professional army whose loyalty belonged to the Great Khan alone. Units were deliberately mixed, combining warriors from different tribes to prevent the formation of potentially rebellious ethnic coalitions. The famous decimal organization allowed for unprecedented coordination and flexibility in battle, while the promotion of skilled individuals from any background created a leadership cadre bound to the Great Khan by personal loyalty rather than traditional obligations. The intelligence and communication systems that would enable the Mongol Empire to coordinate activities across vast distances were also established during this founding period. The Yam, or postal relay system, was created to carry messages swiftly across the steppes, using fresh horses and riders stationed at regular intervals. This network would eventually stretch from Korea to Hungary, enabling the Great Khan to maintain direct contact with his generals and administrators thousands of miles from the Mongol homeland. The ceremony concluded with the distribution of rewards and responsibilities among the assembled leaders. Those who had supported Temujin during his rise to power were given positions of honor and authority, while even former enemies were offered opportunities to serve the new order. This generous treatment of defeated rivals was not merely merciful, but strategically brilliant, demonstrating that the Mongol Empire rewarded loyalty and competence while punishing only those who persisted in opposition. The emotional impact of this great assembly cannot be overstated. The Mongol people, fragmented for generations by tribal rivalries and internecine warfare, now found themselves united under a single banner and a single vision. The endless cycle of revenge and counter-revenge that had characterized steppe politics for centuries was broken, replaced by a legal system that offered justice and a military retry, promised protection for all who submitted to the Great Khan's authority. As the delegates prepared to return to their various tribes and territories, carrying word of the great transformation that had taken place, the steppes themselves seemed to vibrate with anticipation. The horses sensed the change in their riders, the shamans read favorable omens in the flight of eagles, and the very wind seemed to carry whispers of the great campaigns that would soon carry the Mongol name to the far corners of the earth. The Kurultai of 1206 marked not just the beginning of Genghis Khan's reign, but the birth of a new form of political organization that would reshape the medieval world. The empire that emerged from this sacred assembly would eventually encompass more territory than any other in human history, but its true significance lay not in its size but in its revolutionary approach to governance, warfare, and cultural exchange. The boy who had once foraged for roots and berries had become the great Khan of a unified nation, ready to launch the campaigns that would transform the Mongol steppes from a backwater of world history into the center of a new global order. The stage was set for conquests that would carry Mongol influence from the rice paddies of China to the vineyards of Europe, creating connections between civilizations that had never before imagined each other's existence. The transformation of the Mongol nation from a collection of warring tribes into the nucleus of the world's largest empire began not with a single dramatic campaign, but with a series of carefully planned expeditions that revealed the revolutionary nature of Mongol warfare and the genius of their great Khan's strategic vision. The first target was the Western Xia, a kingdom that controlled the crucial trade routes between China and Central Asia, whose conquest would provide both wealth and strategic position for the greater campaigns to come. The Western Xia represented everything that traditional steppe warfare had failed to overcome. Their capital, Zhongxing, was protected by massive walls that had withstood centuries of nomadic attacks. Their army combined the mobility of steppe cavalry with the defensive strength of Chinese infantry and the technological sophistication of siege engines and crossbows. Most importantly, they possessed a complex administrative system that generated the wealth necessary to maintain professional armies and elaborate fortifications. Genghis Khan's approach to this challenge revealed the extent to which he had transcended the limitations of traditional nomadic warfare. Rather than simply surrounding the enemy capital and waiting for starvation to force surrender, he launched a systematic campaign designed to destroy the economic foundations of Xia resistance. Mongol forces swept across the countryside, capturing the irrigation systems that sustained agricultural production, seizing the trade routes that generated commercial wealth, and incorporating the skilled artisans and administrators who made the kingdom's prosperity possible. The psychological dimensions of this campaign were as important as its military aspects. The Mongols cultivated a reputation for invincibility that often caused enemy forces to surrender without fighting, while their treatment of conquered populations combined calculated terror with generous rewards for submission. Cities that resisted were subjected to complete destruction, their populations massacred or enslaved, their very existence erased from the landscape. Cities that surrendered, by contrast, were treated with remarkable clemency, their inhabitants protected and their economic activities encouraged under Mongol supervision. The siege of Zhongxing itself demonstrated the Mongols' ability to adapt and incorporate new military technologies. Chinese engineers, some captured in earlier campaigns, and others attracted by the promise of advancement under Mongol rule, provided the technical expertise necessary to construct siege engines and undermine fortifications. The traditional Mongol emphasis on mobility was combined with the patient, methodical approach necessary for siege warfare, creating a new form of military organization that could succeed in any environment. The fall of the Western Shah marked the beginning of a new phase in world history, one in which the traditional barriers between nomadic and sedentary civilizations would be systematically dismantled. The wealth captured in this campaign provided the resources necessary for even greater expeditions, while the administrative and military techniques learned from Chinese advisors would prove invaluable in governing the vast territories that would soon come under Mongol control. The conquest of the Jin dynasty presented challenges of an entirely different magnitude. This was not a small border kingdom, but one of the great powers of medieval Asia, controlling northern China and possessing military resources that dwarfed those of any previous Mongol opponent. The Jin armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Their cities were protected by engineering marvels that had required generations to complete, and their economic system generated wealth on a scale that the nomadic peoples of the steppes had never imagined. Yet the very size and complexity of the Jin Empire created vulnerabilities that Genghis Khan was uniquely positioned to exploit. The empire's vast territories could not be simultaneously defended. Its diverse populations harbored resentments that could be exploited by skilled diplomats, and its sophisticated military system depended on logistical networks that were vulnerable to disruption by mobile forces. The Mongol invasion of Jin territory began with a series of lightning raids that demonstrated the revolutionized nature of steppe warfare. Rather than the traditional pattern of seasonal campaigns followed by winter retreats, the Mongols maintained continuous pressure throughout the year, their superior mobility allowing them to strike at unexpected targets while avoiding the concentrated strength of enemy armies. The decimal organization of Mongol forces enabled coordination on a scale previously impossible, while their intelligence networks provided detailed information about enemy movements and weaknesses. The psychological impact of these early victories was enormous. The Jin Empire, which had considered itself invulnerable to barbarian attack, found its northern provinces systematically devastated by an enemy that seemed to appear and disappear at will. The traditional Chinese strategy of using fortifications to channel and contain nomadic invasions proved useless against an opponent who could coordinate the movements of multiple armies across hundreds of miles of territory. The siege of Beijing, the Jin capital, became a symbol of the new age that was dawning. The city's walls, which had protected it for centuries, were breached by siege engines constructed under the supervision of Chinese engineers who had joined the Mongol cause. The defenders, who had relied on traditional methods of warfare, found themselves outmaneuvered by an enemy who combined nomadic mobility with sedentary technical knowledge. The massacre that followed the city's fall was not merely an act of revenge, but a calculated demonstration of the consequences of resistance. The Mongols understood that their relatively small numbers made it impossible to garrison every conquered city, so they relied on terror to discourage rebellion while offering generous terms to those who submitted voluntarily. This policy of discriminating brutality was morally questionable but strategically effective, creating a climate of fear that often made actual conquest unnecessary. The incorporation of Chinese administrative techniques into Mongol governance represented a crucial step in the empire's evolution, from a nomadic confederation to a truly imperial system. The Mongols, who had previously governed through personal relationships and tribal customs, now began to develop the bureaucratic structures necessary to administer sedentary populations. Chinese scholars and administrators, attracted by the opportunities for advancement under Mongol rule, provided the expertise necessary to collect taxes, maintain records, and coordinate the activities of vast territories. The transformation of the Mongol military system during this period was equally significant. The traditional emphasis on mounted archery was supplemented by siege equipment, infantry formations, and naval forces that enabled the Mongols to operate in any environment. The decimal system of organization was expanded to accommodate specialists in engineering, administration, and logistics, while the meritocratic principles that had enabled Genghis Khan's rise to power were applied to the integration of foreign experts and advisors. The campaigns in Central Asia revealed yet another dimension of Mongol military genius. The great trading cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv represented concentrations of wealth and culture that had flourished for centuries under the protection of the Khwarezmian Empire. Their conquest required not just military skill, but diplomatic finesse, as the Mongols sought to preserve the economic networks that generated the city's prosperity while incorporating their populations into the expanding empire. The destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire was precipitated by a diplomatic incident that revealed the extent to which the Mongols had transcended their origins as mere raiders. Genghis Khan's initial approach to the Khwarezm Shah was peaceful, seeking to establish trade relationships that would benefit both empires. When Mongol merchants were murdered by local officials, the Great Khan's response was not the impulsive revenge that might have been expected from a nomadic chieftain, but a carefully planned campaign designed to achieve both justice and strategic advantage. The systematic nature of the Central Asian campaign demonstrated the maturation of Mongol military organization. Rather than simply plundering and withdrawing, the Mongols established permanent control over conquered territories, incorporating their populations and resources into the expanding empire. The great cities that had once controlled the Silk Road trade routes now served as administrative centers for Mongol governance, their merchants and craftsmen contributing to the economic prosperity of the new order. The human cost of these conquests was enormous, with entire populations displaced or destroyed in the course of the Mongol expansion. Yet the same campaigns that brought devastation to some regions also created opportunities for cultural exchange and economic development that would not have been possible under the previous system of competing kingdoms and empires. The Mongol peace that followed conquest enabled trade to flourish on an unprecedented scale, while the empire's religious tolerance allowed for intellectual exchange between civilizations that had previously been isolated from each other. The speed and scope of Mongol expansion during this period was unprecedented in human history. Within a single generation, the empire had grown from a collection of nomadic tribes to a power that controlled territory from Korea to the Caspian Sea. This expansion was not random or opportunistic, but followed a clear strategic vision that sought to unite the Eurasian continent under a single system of law, administration, and trade. The revolutionary nature of Mongol warfare extended beyond mere military technique to encompass a fundamental transformation in the relationship between nomadic and sedentary civilizations. Where previous nomadic invasions had been primarily destructive, seeking only to plunder the wealth of agricultural societies, the Mongols created a new synthesis that preserved and enhanced the productive capacity of conquered territories, while extending the benefits of nomadic mobility and adaptability to sedentary populations. As the great campaigns of conquest continued, the Mongol Empire was simultaneously creating the administrative and cultural foundations that would enable it to govern the vast territories it was acquiring. The boy who had once struggled to survive on the harsh steppes of Mongolia had become the architect of a new world order, one that would transform the nature of civilization itself and create connections between peoples and cultures that would endure long after the empire itself had faded into history. In the wake of Mongol conquest, something miraculous began to emerge from the ashes of destroyed cities and the ruins of ancient kingdoms. The trade routes that had connected East and West for centuries, but had been fragmented by political boundaries and threatened by bandits and warlords, suddenly found themselves under the protection of a single, vast empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe. The Silk Road, that legendary network of caravan routes that had carried goods and ideas across the Eurasian continent, was about to experience its golden age under the protective shadow of Mongol power. The transformation was not immediate, but it was profound. Where once merchants had faced the constant threat of robbery, warfare, and extortion from competing kingdoms, they now traveled under the protection of the Great Khan's seal, which guaranteed safe passage throughout the empire. The Mongol postal system, the Yam, which had been created to carry military communications, was extended to serve commercial needs, providing fresh horses and supplies for traders who carried the empire's commercial passport. Picture, if you will, a caravan setting out from the great city of Karakoram, the Mongol capital that had risen from the steppes like a dream made manifest. The caravan master, perhaps a Persian merchant who had learned to navigate the complex web of Mongol administration, would carry papers written in multiple languages and scripts, documenting his cargo and guaranteeing his right to trade throughout the empire. His pack animals would bear silk from China, spices from India, precious metals from the mountains of Central Asia, and manufactured goods from the workshops of conquered cities. The journey that had once taken years and claimed countless lives from disease, warfare, and natural disaster could now be completed in months with reasonable safety. The Mongols had not just conquered territory, they had created a new form of international order that made long-distance trade practical on a scale never before imagined. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency across the empire meant that a merchant could conduct business in Beijing using the same systems that applied in Baghdad, while the Mongol emphasis on religious tolerance meant that Muslim, Christian, and Buddhist traders could all operate within the same commercial framework. The revival of the Silk Road was not merely an economic phenomenon, but a cultural one as well. The same caravan routes that carried goods also carried ideas, technologies, and artistic influences that would transform the civilizations they touched. Chinese papermaking techniques spread westward, while Islamic mathematical concepts traveled eastward. The magnetic compass, which had been used by Chinese navigators for centuries, found its way into the hands of European explorers, while the printing press, invented in China, would eventually revolutionize European scholarship and communication. The great trading cities of Central Asia, which had been devastated by the initial Mongol conquest, experienced a remarkable renaissance under imperial protection. Samarkand, with its magnificent madrasas and bustling bazaars, became a center of learning where scholars from across the known world gathered to study and debate. The city's workshops produced textiles, metalwork, and ceramics that combined Chinese techniques with Islamic aesthetics, creating new forms of artistic expression that would influence craftsmen from Venice to Beijing. Bukhara, the ancient center of Islamic learning, found new life as a cosmopolitan hub where Persian poetry was recited in the same halls where Chinese philosophers debated the nature of reality. The city's great library, which had been threatened with destruction during the conquest, was not only preserved, but expanded, as Mongol rulers proved surprisingly supportive of scholarship and intellectual exchange. The synthesis of Islamic and Chinese learning that occurred in these centers would produce advances in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine that would benefit all of humanity. The human dimension of this cultural exchange was perhaps most visible in the great households of Mongol nobles, where Chinese courtiers served alongside Persian administrators, where European craftsmen worked with Central Asian artists, and where the children of the elite learned to speak multiple languages and navigate multiple cultural systems. The Mongol aristocracy, which had originated in the simple felt tents of the steppes, now maintained courts that rivaled those of the great sedentary empires in their sophistication and cosmopolitan character. The role of women in this transformed world was particularly significant. Mongol women, who had always enjoyed greater freedom and authority than their counterparts in many sedentary societies, now found themselves at the center of vast commercial and cultural networks. The Great Khan's wives and daughters maintained their own trading enterprises, their own diplomatic contacts, and their own cultural patronage, creating parallel networks of influence that complemented and sometimes competed with the official imperial administration. The religious tolerance that characterized Mongol rule created unprecedented opportunities for theological exchange and debate. The Great Khan's court regularly hosted discussions between representatives of different faiths, seeking to understand the various paths to divine truth. Christian missionaries found themselves debating with Buddhist monks, while Islamic scholars engaged with Confucian philosophers, creating a level of interfaith dialogue that would not be seen again until the modern era. The technological exchange that occurred along the Silk Road under Mongol protection would have consequences that extended far beyond the borders of the empire itself. The westward transmission of Chinese innovations like gunpowder, paper money, and mechanical clocks would transform European civilization, while the eastward flow of Islamic astronomical instruments and mathematical techniques would enhance Chinese scientific capabilities. The Mongol Empire had become a vast laboratory for technological synthesis and innovation. The economic impact of this revitalized trade was enormous. The Mongol Empire generated wealth not just through conquest and tribute, but through the taxes and fees collected from the merchants who used the protected trade routes. This commercial revenue enabled the Mongols to maintain their vast military forces without completely draining the economies of conquered territories, creating a more sustainable form of imperial rule than had been achieved by previous nomadic conquerors. The standardization of commercial practices across the empire created efficiencies that benefited everyone involved in long-distance trade. A merchant's reputation in one city would be recognized throughout the empire, while commercial contracts signed in one location would be enforceable in courts thousands of miles away. The Mongol legal system, which had been developed to govern nomadic warriors, proved remarkably adaptable to the needs of sedentary commerce and urban life. The cultural synthesis that emerged from this period of intensive exchange was not merely additive, but genuinely creative, producing new forms of art, literature, and scholarship that drew from multiple traditions while creating something entirely novel. The Persian miniature paintings that were produced in the workshops of Mongol-controlled cities combined Chinese landscape techniques with Islamic calligraphy and nomadic themes, creating a new visual language that would influence artistic development throughout the Islamic world. The musical traditions that emerged from this cultural mixing were equally innovative. The courts of Mongol nobles became centers for musical experimentation, where Chinese instruments were combined with Persian melodies and Mongol rhythms to create new forms of composition. The epic songs that had celebrated the deeds of steppe warriors were transformed into sophisticated court entertainments that incorporated literary and musical elements from across the empire. The intellectual ferment that characterized this period produced scholars whose work transcended the boundaries of their individual cultures. The Persian historian Rashid al-Din, who served as vizier to the Mongol rulers of Persia, wrote a universal history that attempted to synthesize the historical traditions of all the peoples within the empire. His work, which drew on Chinese, Islamic, Christian, and Mongol sources, represented a new form of scholarship that sought to understand human history as a single, interconnected narrative. The medical knowledge that was exchanged through these networks had immediate practical benefits. Chinese acupuncture techniques were combined with Islamic pharmaceutical knowledge and Mongol veterinary practices to create new forms of healing that were more effective than any single tradition could provide. The hospitals that were established in the major cities of the empire became centers for medical research and innovation, where practitioners from different traditions could learn from each other and develop new treatments. The agricultural innovations that spread through the empire were equally significant. Chinese irrigation techniques were adapted to the arid conditions of Central Asia, while Middle Eastern crop varieties were introduced to the fertile valleys of China. The Mongol emphasis on practical results, rather than traditional methods, encouraged experimentation and innovation in farming practices, leading to increased agricultural productivity throughout the empire. The astronomical knowledge that was exchanged through these networks would have profound implications for navigation and timekeeping. The Chinese magnetic compass, combined with Islamic astronomical tables and Mongol knowledge of steppe geography, enabled more accurate navigation across vast distances. The astronomical observatories that were established in the major cities of the empire became centers for scientific research that would influence the development of astronomy and mathematics for centuries to come. As the Silk Road reached its peak under Mongol protection, it became clear that something unprecedented in human history was occurring. The empire had created not just a political and military unity, but a cultural and economic synthesis that was transforming the very nature of civilization. The nomadic peoples of the steppes, who had been dismissed by sedentary societies as mere barbarians, had become the architects of the world's first truly global civilization, one that would leave its mark on every aspect of human development long after the empire itself had passed into history. The death of Genghis Khan in 1227, during the campaign against the Western Shia, marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new phase in the evolution of the Mongol Empire. The Great Khan, who had united the scattered tribes of the steppes and launched the conquests that would reshape the world, passed away quietly in his tent, his body carried back to the sacred mountains of Mongolia for burial in a secret location that remains unknown to this day. With his death, the empire faced its first great test: whether the revolutionary system he had created could survive the transition from charismatic founder to institutional successor. The succession had been planned with characteristic foresight. Genghis Khan had designated his third son, Ugadai, as his heir, passing over the elder Jochi and Chagatai in favor of a son whose diplomatic skills and administrative acumen seemed better suited to the challenges of governing a vast empire. This decision, made during a great Kurultai held while the Great Khan still lived, was designed to prevent the kind of succession crisis that had torn apart other nomadic empires in the past. Yet the very success of Mongol expansion had created new challenges that even Genghis Khan's wisdom could not entirely anticipate. The empire had grown too large to be governed effectively from a single center, encompassing territories and peoples so diverse that no single ruler could hope to understand all their needs and characteristics. The descendants of the Great Khan, raised in different parts of the empire and influenced by different cultural traditions, began to develop their own visions of how Mongol power should be exercised. Ogadai Khan, who ruled from 1229 to 1241, proved to be an able successor who continued his father's policies while adapting them to the needs of a maturing empire. His reign saw the completion of the conquest of the Jin dynasty, the systematic organization of the Chinese territories under Mongol rule, and the beginning of the Great Western campaigns that would carry Mongol armies to the gates of Vienna. Under his leadership, the empire reached its greatest extent, with Mongol forces simultaneously operating in Hungary, Korea, and the mountains of Tibet. The administrative innovations of Ögedei's reign were as significant as his military achievements. The decimal system of organization was extended to encompass civilian administration, with Chinese bureaucrats working alongside Mongol nobles to create a hybrid system of governance that could function effectively across vast distances and diverse populations. The capital city of Karakorum was expanded and beautified, becoming a truly cosmopolitan center where merchants and diplomats from across the known world could conduct their business. The religious tolerance that had characterized Genghis Khan's rule was maintained and even extended under Ögedei. The Great Khan's court became a center for theological discussion and debate, where representatives of different faiths could present their doctrines and engage in philosophical dialogue. This policy was not merely pragmatic, but reflected a genuine intellectual curiosity about the various paths to divine truth, a characteristic that would distinguish Mongol rule from that of many other empires. The great campaigns in Europe during Ögedei's reign demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of Mongol military organization and the growing sophistication of their strategic thinking. The invasions of Russia, Poland, and Hungary were not random raids, but carefully coordinated operations designed to establish permanent Mongol control over these territories. The decimal system of military organization enabled unprecedented coordination between armies operating hundreds of miles apart, while the Mongol intelligence networks provided detailed information about enemy capabilities and intentions. The death of Ögedei in 1241 precipitated the first major succession crisis in Mongol history. The Great Khan had designated his son Guyuk as his successor, but this choice was contested by other branches of the royal family, particularly the descendants of Tolui, the youngest son of Genghis Khan. The resulting political struggle revealed the growing tensions within the empire and the increasing difficulty of maintaining unity across such vast territories. The regency of Turagen Khatan, Ögedei's widow, demonstrated the continued importance of women in Mongol political life. For 5 years, she effectively ruled the empire while maneuvering to secure her son's succession, showing the same political acumen that had characterized other Mongol queens. Her ability to maintain imperial unity during this period of uncertainty was crucial to the empire's survival, preventing the fragmentation that might have occurred under a weaker leadership. The brief reign of Guyuk Khan, 1246 to 1248, was marked by increasing tensions between different factions within the royal family. The empire's vast size made it impossible for any single ruler to maintain direct control over all territories, while the growing cultural differences between Mongol nobles who had been raised in different parts of the empire created conflicting loyalties and interests. The stage was being set for the eventual division of the empire into separate Khanates, each adapted to the needs and characteristics of its particular region. The succession of Mongol Khan in 1251 represented the triumph of the Toluid branch of the family and marked the beginning of the empire's transformation into a loose confederation of related but increasingly independent Khanates. Mongol's reign saw the systematic organization of the empire's administration and the beginning of the great campaigns that would complete the conquest of Song China and extend Mongol power into Southeast Asia and the Middle East. The four Khanates that emerged from this period of political evolution each reflected the influence of local conditions and cultures while maintaining their connection to the broader Mongol identity. The Yuan dynasty in China, established by Kublai Khan, represented the most complete synthesis of Mongol and Chinese political traditions. The Ilkhanate in Persia became a center for Islamic learning and artistic achievement. The Golden Horde in Russia maintained many traditional nomadic practices while adapting to the needs of governing sedentary populations. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia remained closest to the original Mongol traditions, while serving as a bridge between the eastern and western parts of the empire. The Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of Mongol political institutions. The Great Khan, who had been raised in the cosmopolitan environment of Karakoram, proved capable of governing China according to Chinese traditions while maintaining his Mongol identity. His court became a center for cultural exchange, where Chinese scholars worked alongside Persian administrators and European merchants, creating a synthesis of traditions that would influence East Asian civilization for centuries. The establishment of the new capital at Dadu, modern Beijing, symbolized the transformation of the Mongol Empire from a nomadic confederation to a settled imperial system. The city's magnificent palaces and gardens, described in wonder by visitors like Marco Polo, represented the culmination of Mongol architectural and artistic achievement. Yet the same court that displayed such magnificent civilization also maintained the traditional Mongol emphasis on meritocracy and cultural tolerance. The Ilkhanate in Persia represented a different form of cultural synthesis, one that combined Mongol political traditions with Islamic religious and administrative practices. The gradual conversion of the Mongol elite to Islam did not represent a rejection of their heritage, but rather its adaptation to local conditions. The magnificent cities of Tabriz and Isfahan became centers for artistic and intellectual achievement that rivaled anything in the contemporary world. The Golden Horde's control over the Russian principalities demonstrated yet another form of Mongol adaptability. The Khans of the Golden Horde maintained their nomadic lifestyle while exercising political control over sedentary populations, creating a system that preserved traditional Mongol customs while generating the wealth necessary to maintain their military and administrative systems. The tribute system that they established would influence Russian political development for centuries. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia remained the most traditionally Mongol of the four successor states, maintaining the nomadic lifestyle and military traditions that had characterized the original empire. Yet even here, the influence of sedentary civilizations was apparent in the adoption of Islamic religious practices and the development of urban centers that served as bases for trade and administration. The family rivalries that characterized this period were not merely personal disputes, but reflected fundamental disagreements about the future direction of Mongol civilization. Some members of the royal family, particularly those who had been raised in the traditional nomadic environment, believed that the empire should maintain its steppe origins and resist the corrupting influence of sedentary civilizations. Others, particularly those who had been educated in the courts of conquered territories, argued that adaptation to local conditions was necessary for effective governance. The religious conversions that occurred during this period were both a cause and a consequence of the empire's fragmentation. The adoption of Islam by the Western Khanates and Buddhism by some of the Eastern rulers reflected the growing influence of local religious traditions, but it also created new sources of division within the Mongol elite. The universal shamanic traditions that had united the original Mongol Confederation gave way to a plurality of religious practices that sometimes conflicted with each other. The administrative challenges of governing such a vast empire were becoming increasingly apparent. The Yam postal system, which had been designed to serve the needs of a nomadic army, was strained by the demands of governing sedentary populations. The decimal system of organization, which had worked well for military campaigns, proved less effective for the complex administrative needs of agricultural and commercial territories. Despite these challenges, the period of the four Khanates represented the height of Mongol cultural and economic achievement. The empire had created a system of international trade and cultural exchange that was unprecedented in human history, while the religious tolerance and administrative flexibility that characterized Mongol rule had enabled a flowering of artistic and intellectual achievement that would influence world civilization for centuries to come. The fragmentation of political authority had not destroyed the essential unity of Mongol civilization, but had rather adapted it to the diverse needs of the territories under Mongol control. The 13th and 14th centuries witnessed something unprecedented in human history, a transformation so profound that its echoes would resonate through the corridors of time into our modern era. As the great Mongol Empire reached its zenith and began its gradual metamorphosis into distinct regional Khanates, there emerged across the vast expanse of Eurasia a phenomenon that scholars would later call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. This was not merely the absence of warfare, though the Mongol military system had indeed succeeded in suppressing the constant conflicts that had previously characterized relations between the various kingdoms and empires of Asia. Rather, it was the creation of a new form of international order that actively promoted exchange and interaction between previously isolated civilizations. The Mongol Empire had become a vast laboratory for cultural synthesis and technological innovation, where the accumulated wisdom of humanity's greatest civilizations could be combined and refined. Imagine, if you will, a world where the boundaries between East and West, between nomadic and sedentary cultures, between different religious traditions, became permeable membranes through which ideas, technologies, and artistic visions could flow freely. This was the achievement of the Mongol peace, not just the conquest of territory, but the creation of a new kind of human civilization. The safety of travel across this enormous territory was perhaps the most immediate and visible benefit of Mongol rule. A merchant could now journey from the canals of Venice to the forbidden city of Beijing, or from the steppes of Moscow to the spice markets of Delhi, carrying nothing more than the Great Khan's commercial passport and confident that he would be protected by imperial authority throughout his journey. The banditry and petty warfare that had made long-distance travel a desperate gamble were now suppressed by the efficient Mongol military system, while the standardization of legal and commercial practices across the empire meant that a trader familiar with procedures in one city could conduct business effectively anywhere within the imperial boundaries. The great city of Karakorum, which had risen from the Mongol steppes to become the cosmopolitan heart of the empire, exemplified this new international order. Walking through its bustling streets, a visitor might encounter Chinese silk merchants negotiating with Persian spice traders, European craftsmen working alongside Central Asian artisans, and scholars from every corner of the known world engaged in passionate debates about philosophy, science, and theology. The city's workshops produced goods that combined techniques and aesthetic traditions from across the empire, creating new forms of artistic expression that would influence cultural development for centuries. The Mongol postal system, the Yam, had evolved from its original military purpose to become the world's first truly international communication network. Messages could travel from the imperial capital to the farthest provinces in a matter of weeks rather than months, enabling a level of administrative coordination that had never before been possible. More importantly, this same system facilitated the exchange of ideas and information between scholars and intellectuals who might otherwise have remained isolated within their own cultural traditions. The religious tolerance that had characterized Mongol rule from its inception created unprecedented opportunities for theological dialogue and spiritual exchange. The Great Khan's court regularly hosted debates between representatives of different faiths, not with the intention of determining which religion was superior, but rather to understand the various paths that human beings had discovered in their search for divine truth. Christian missionaries found themselves in respectful dialogue with Buddhist monks, while Islamic scholars engaged with Confucian philosophers, creating a level of interfaith understanding that would not be achieved again until the modern era. This climate of religious tolerance had practical as well as spiritual benefits. The Mongol Empire was able to draw upon the administrative and technological expertise of all its subject peoples, regardless of their religious beliefs. Christian administrators from the Byzantine Empire worked alongside Muslim bureaucrats from Persia and Buddhist scholars from Tibet, creating a cosmopolitan governing class that could adapt to the needs of any territory within the empire. The meritocratic principles that had enabled Genghis Khan's rise to power were extended to include talent from every religious and cultural tradition. The technological exchange that occurred under Mongol protection would have consequences that extended far beyond the borders of the empire itself. The westward transmission of Chinese innovations like gunpowder, paper money, and mechanical clocks would transform European civilization, contributing to the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. The eastward flow of Islamic astronomical instruments and mathematical techniques would enhance Chinese scientific capabilities, while the preservation and translation of classical texts would ensure that the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome would survive and flourish in new cultural contexts. The economic impact of this revitalized trade was transformative. The Mongol Empire generated wealth not just through conquest and tribute, but through the taxes and fees collected from the merchants who used the protected trade routes. This commercial revenue enabled the Mongols to maintain their vast military and administrative systems without completely draining the economies of conquered territories, creating a more sustainable form of imperial rule than had been achieved by previous conquerors. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency across the empire created efficiencies that benefited everyone involved in long-distance trade. A merchant's reputation in one city would be recognized throughout the empire, while commercial contracts signed in one location would be enforceable in courts thousands of miles away. The Mongol legal system, which had been developed to govern nomadic warriors, proved remarkably adaptable to the needs of sedentary commerce and urban life. The cultural synthesis that emerged from this period of intensive exchange was genuinely creative, producing new forms of art, literature, and scholarship that drew from multiple traditions while creating something entirely novel. The Persian miniature paintings that were produced in the workshops of Mongol-controlled cities combined Chinese landscape techniques with Islamic calligraphy and nomadic themes, creating a new visual language that would influence artistic development throughout the Islamic world. The musical traditions that emerged from this cultural mixing were equally innovative, as Chinese instruments were combined with Persian melodies and Mongol rhythms to create new forms of composition. The intellectual ferment that characterized this period produced scholars whose work transcended the boundaries of their individual cultures. The great libraries of Baghdad, Beijing, and Samarkand became centers for translation and commentary, where texts from different traditions were brought together and compared. The astronomical observations made in the observatories of Mariga and Beijing were shared across the empire, leading to advances in mathematical and scientific understanding that would influence the development of astronomy and navigation for centuries. The medical knowledge that was exchanged through these networks had immediate practical benefits. Chinese acupuncture techniques were combined with Islamic pharmaceutical knowledge and Mongol veterinary practices to create new forms of healing that were more effective than any single tradition could provide. The hospitals that were established in the major cities of the empire became centers for medical research and innovation, where practitioners from different traditions could learn from each other and develop new treatments. The agricultural innovations that spread through the empire were equally significant. Chinese irrigation techniques were adapted to the arid conditions of Central Asia, while Middle Eastern crop varieties were introduced to the fertile valleys of China. The Mongol emphasis on practical results rather than traditional methods encouraged experimentation and innovation in farming practices, leading to increased agricultural productivity throughout the empire. The urban planning and architectural innovations that emerged from this period reflected the cosmopolitan character of Mongol civilization. The great cities of the empire were designed to accommodate populations from many different cultural backgrounds, with separate quarters for different religious and ethnic communities, while maintaining overall unity of design and function. The public buildings that were constructed during this period combined architectural elements from different traditions, creating new forms of monumental architecture that would influence urban development across Eurasia. The legal and administrative innovations that emerged from the need to govern such diverse populations would have lasting influence on the development of international law and diplomacy. The concept of diplomatic immunity, which protected envoys and ambassadors from harm while traveling through foreign territories, was refined and systematized under Mongol rule. The standardization of commercial law across the empire created precedents that would influence the development of international trade law for centuries. The educational systems that emerged in the major cities of the empire were designed to produce administrators and scholars who could function effectively across cultural boundaries. The great madrasas of Samarkand and Baghdad, the Confucian academies of Beijing and Karakoram, and the Christian schools of Central Asia all contributed to the development of a new kind of intellectual culture that valued learning from multiple traditions. Students at these institutions were expected to master not just the knowledge of their own cultural background, but to understand and appreciate the wisdom of other civilizations as well. Yet, even as the Mongol Empire reached its cultural and economic zenith, the seeds of its eventual transformation were already taking root. The very success of the Pax Mongolica contained within it the forces that would eventually lead to the empire's fragmentation and decline. The gradual assimilation of Mongol elites into local cultures, while initially a source of administrative strength, would eventually erode the distinctive nomadic traditions that had made the empire possible in the first place. The process was subtle at first, almost imperceptible to contemporary observers. Mongol administrators in China began to adopt Chinese customs and philosophical perspectives, while their counterparts in Persia embraced Islamic traditions and their relatives in Russia adapted to Byzantine and Orthodox Christian practices. This cultural adaptation was not merely superficial, it represented a fundamental transformation in worldview, as the descendants of steppe warriors gradually lost their connection to the nomadic lifestyle that had forged their ancestors' unique military and organizational capabilities. The technological innovations that had initially given the Mongols their decisive military advantage were gradually being adopted and improved upon by their subjects. The composite bow, the mounted archer tactics, and the decimal system of military organization were no longer exclusively Mongol innovations, but had become part of the general military knowledge of Eurasia. At the same time, new technologies were emerging that would eventually neutralize the traditional advantages of steppe warfare. The development of gunpowder weapons, initially a Chinese innovation that the Mongols had helped to spread, would eventually transform the nature of warfare itself. Fortified cities, equipped with cannons and defended by professional infantry armed with firearms, became increasingly difficult for traditional cavalry forces to conquer. The tactical flexibility that had made Mongol armies so effective against the military systems of the 13th century became less relevant as warfare evolved toward the use of gunpowder weapons and professional standing armies. The economic foundations of the empire were also beginning to shift. The commercial revenues that had supplemented traditional tribute and taxation were becoming increasingly important to imperial finances, but this dependence on trade made the empire vulnerable to economic disruption. The Black Death, which spread along the same trade routes that had brought prosperity to the Mongol Empire, would devastate the population of Eurasia and seriously disrupt the commercial networks that had become essential to imperial administration. The succession disputes that had plagued the empire from its earliest days became more serious as the various Khanates became more culturally distinct and politically autonomous. The unity of command that had been maintained under Genghis Khan and his immediate successors was increasingly difficult to preserve as the empire's territories became more diverse and its rulers more invested in their local power bases than in the maintenance of imperial unity. The conversion of Mongol rulers to local religions, while initially a source of legitimacy and administrative efficiency, would eventually contribute to the fragmentation of the empire. The Islamic Mongols of Central Asia and Persia began to see themselves as primarily Muslim rulers rather than Mongol Khans, while the Buddhist Mongols of the Yuan dynasty in China increasingly identified with Chinese imperial traditions rather than with their steppe origins. The abandonment of traditional nomadic practices by the Mongol elite represented perhaps the most fundamental transformation of all. The harsh disciplines of steppe life, the constant movement, the intimate knowledge of horses and livestock, the ability to survive on the margins of agricultural civilization, had forged the character traits that made the Mongol conquests possible. As successive generations of Mongol nobility became accustomed to the comforts and luxuries of sedentary life, they gradually lost the physical and psychological toughness that had made their ancestors so formidable. The rise of new military technologies and tactical innovations meant that the traditional advantages of steppe warfare were becoming obsolete. The development of improved fortification techniques, the professionalization of infantry forces, and the increasing use of gunpowder weapons created new forms of military organization that were better suited to the defense of sedentary territories than to the mobile campaigns that had characterized the great age of Mongol expansion. Yet even as the political unity of the Mongol Empire dissolved, its cultural and intellectual legacy continued to influence the development of Eurasian civilization. The patterns of trade and cultural exchange that had been established during the period of Mongol rule would persist long after the empire itself had fragmented into competing successor states. The religious tolerance, administrative innovations, and technological advances that had characterized Mongol rule would continue to shape the development of international relations and cultural synthesis for centuries to come. The gradual decline of Mongol power was not a sudden collapse, but rather a slow transformation, as the empire evolved from a unified political entity into a collection of culturally distinct successor states that maintained some of the administrative and cultural innovations of the original empire while adapting to local conditions and traditions. This process of transformation and adaptation would continue for centuries, as the various Mongol Khanates gradually merged into the broader patterns of Eurasian political and cultural development. As we reflect on this period of gradual decline, we can see that it was not simply a story of failure or decay, but rather a natural evolution in the life cycle of a great empire. The Mongol Empire had achieved something unprecedented in human history: the creation of a truly global civilization that connected the far corners of the known world in a network of trade, communication, and cultural exchange. While the political unity of that empire could not be maintained indefinitely, its cultural and intellectual achievements would continue to influence the development of human civilization for generations to come. Tonight, as you rest in the comfort of your bed, remember that you are part of this great human story of connection and transformation. The world you inhabit, with its global networks of communication and trade, its cultural diversity and religious tolerance, its technological innovation and intellectual exchange, owes much to the vision and achievements of those nomadic warriors who once rode across the steppes of Mongolia with dreams of uniting the world under one sky. In the western reaches of the Mongol Empire, where the ancient trade routes connected the Mediterranean world with the markets of Central Asia, a profound transformation was taking place that would fundamentally alter the nature of Mongol civilization. The gradual conversion of the Mongol elite to Islam represented not merely a change in religious affiliation, but a complex process of cultural synthesis that would create entirely new forms of artistic, intellectual, and political expression. The Ilkhanate of Persia, established by Hulagu Khan in the 13th century, became the laboratory for this remarkable cultural metamorphosis. Here, in the sophisticated courts of Tabriz and Maragay, Mongol rulers like Ghazan Khan would attempt to reconcile their nomadic heritage with the refined traditions of Islamic civilization. This was not a simple adoption of foreign customs, but rather a creative synthesis that combined the practical wisdom of steppe governance with the sophisticated theological and philosophical traditions of Islam. The conversion of Ghazan Khan to Islam in 1295 marked a crucial turning point in this process. Yet his embrace of the Islamic faith was not accompanied by a complete abandonment of Mongol traditions. Instead, he created a unique hybrid form of governance that combined Islamic law with Mongol administrative practices, creating a system that was both recognizably Islamic and distinctively Mongol. The coins minted during his reign bore Arabic inscriptions praising Allah alongside traditional Mongol symbols, while his court ceremonies blended Islamic ritual with steppe customs. The architectural achievements of this period reflected this cultural synthesis in concrete form. The magnificent mosques and madrasas that were constructed in the major cities of the Ilkhanate combined traditional Islamic architectural elements with decorative motifs drawn from Chinese and nomadic traditions. The result was a distinctive architectural style that influenced building techniques throughout the Islamic world, creating new forms of monumental expression that would inspire architects for centuries to come. The intellectual ferment that characterized this period of cultural synthesis produced scholars whose work transcended the boundaries of individual traditions. The great historian Rashid al-Din, a Persian Jewish physician who served as vizier to several Mongol rulers, exemplified this cosmopolitan intellectual culture. His universal history, the James al-Tawarikh, attempted to synthesize the historical traditions of all the peoples within the Mongol Empire, creating a global narrative that was unprecedented in its scope and ambition. The manuscript workshops that produced illuminated copies of Rashid al-Din's work became centers for artistic innovation, where Chinese painting techniques were combined with Islamic calligraphy and Mongol subject matter to create a new visual language. The miniature paintings that emerged from these workshops depicted Mongol rulers and Chinese sages alongside Islamic prophets and Persian heroes, creating a visual representation of the cultural synthesis that characterized this period. The religious tolerance that had characterized Mongol rule from its inception continued even after the conversion of many rulers to Islam. The courts of the Khanate continued to employ Christian administrators, Buddhist scholars, and traditional shamans alongside Muslim bureaucrats and theologians. This religious pluralism was not merely a matter of practical convenience, but reflected a deeper philosophical commitment to the idea that divine truth could be approached through multiple paths. The scientific and technological innovations that emerged from this period of cultural synthesis had lasting influence on the development of Islamic civilization. The astronomical observations made at the Observatory of Marageh, which was established under the patronage of Mongol rulers, contributed to advances in mathematical and astronomical understanding that would influence the work of later Islamic scholars and eventually contribute to the scientific revolution in Europe. The medical knowledge that was exchanged through these networks combined Chinese acupuncture techniques with Islamic pharmaceutical knowledge and traditional Mongol veterinary practices to create new forms of healing that were more effective than any single tradition could provide. The hospitals that were established in the major cities of the Khanate became centers for medical research and innovation, where practitioners from different traditions could learn from each other and develop new treatments. The agricultural innovations that spread through the Mongol territories during this period reflected the same spirit of practical experimentation that characterized other aspects of Mongol rule. Chinese irrigation techniques were adapted to the arid conditions of Central Asia, while Middle Eastern crop varieties were introduced to the fertile valleys of China. The Mongol emphasis on practical results rather than traditional methods encouraged experimentation and innovation in farming practices, leading to increased agricultural productivity throughout the empire. The legal and administrative innovations that emerged from the need to govern such diverse populations would have lasting influence on the development of Islamic law and governance. The concept of religious tolerance, which had been refined under Mongol rule, was incorporated into Islamic legal theory in new ways that influenced the development of Islamic jurisprudence for centuries. The administrative techniques that had been developed to govern nomadic warriors were adapted to the needs of sedentary populations, creating new forms of governmental organization that would influence the development of Islamic political theory. The educational systems that emerged in the major cities of the Khanate were designed to produce administrators and scholars who could function effectively across cultural boundaries. The great madrasas of Tabriz and Baghdad became centers for the study of multiple intellectual traditions, where students were expected to master not just the knowledge of their own cultural background, but to understand and appreciate the wisdom of other civilizations as well. The commercial networks that connected the cities of the Khanate with the broader Mongol Empire continued to facilitate the exchange of goods, ideas, and artistic techniques long after the political unity of the empire had dissolved. The merchant communities that had emerged during the period of Mongol rule maintained their connections across cultural and religious boundaries, creating a cosmopolitan commercial culture that would influence the development of international trade for centuries. As we reflect on this period of cultural synthesis and transformation, we can see that it represented something more than a simple process of religious conversion or cultural assimilation. Rather, it was a creative engagement between different civilizational traditions that produced new forms of artistic, intellectual, and political expression that enriched all of the cultures involved. The Islamic Mongol civilization that emerged from this process was neither purely Islamic nor purely Mongol, but something entirely new that drew from both traditions while creating something that transcended the limitations of either. The influence of this cultural synthesis extended far beyond the boundaries of the Mongol Empire itself. The artistic techniques that were developed in the workshops of Tabriz and Maragay influenced the development of Islamic art throughout the Middle East and Central Asia, while the intellectual traditions that emerged from this period of cultural exchange contributed to the development of Islamic philosophy and science for centuries to come. As the Great Mongol Empire gradually dissolved into its constituent parts, its influence on the development of human civilization did not simply vanish with its political unity. Instead, like ripples spreading across the surface of a vast lake, the innovations and achievements of Mongol rule would continue to shape the development of international relations, cultural exchange, and technological progress for centuries to come. The legal and administrative innovations that had emerged from the need to govern such diverse populations would have lasting influence on the development of international law and diplomacy. The concept of diplomatic immunity, which protected envoys and ambassadors from harm while traveling through foreign territories, was refined and systematized under Mongol rule in ways that would influence the development of international relations for centuries. The standardization of commercial law across the empire created precedents that would influence the development of international trade law well into the modern era. The religious tolerance that had characterized Mongol rule from its inception established precedents for the protection of minority religious communities that would influence the development of religious liberty and human rights concepts in later centuries. The idea that a government could and should protect the religious practices of all its subjects, regardless of their particular faith, was revolutionary in the 13th century and would remain influential in the development of modern concepts of religious freedom and cultural diversity. The meritocratic principles that had enabled Genghis Khan's rise to power and had been systematized in the administration of the Mongol Empire would continue to influence the development of governmental and organizational structures throughout Eurasia. The idea that positions of authority should be awarded based on talent and achievement rather than birth or social status was not entirely new, but the systematic application of these principles across such a vast territory and diverse population was unprecedented and would influence the development of modern bureaucratic systems. The technological innovations that had been facilitated by Mongol rule continued to spread and develop long after the empire itself had fragmented. The westward transmission of Chinese innovations like gunpowder, printing, and mechanical clocks would contribute to the Renaissance and the scientific revolution in Europe, while the eastward flow of Islamic mathematical and astronomical knowledge would enhance scientific capabilities throughout Asia. The preservation and translation of classical texts that had been encouraged under Mongol patronage would ensure that the wisdom of ancient civilizations would survive and continue to influence intellectual development. The commercial networks that had been established during the period of Mongol rule would continue to facilitate international trade and cultural exchange for centuries. The idea that merchants should be protected while traveling through foreign territories, that commercial contracts should be enforceable across political boundaries, and that different currencies and measurement systems should be standardized to facilitate trade, would influence the development of international commerce well into the modern era. The urban planning and architectural innovations that had emerged from the need to accommodate diverse populations in the great cities of the Mongol Empire would continue to influence the development of cosmopolitan urban centers throughout Eurasia. The idea that cities should be designed to accommodate populations from many different cultural backgrounds while maintaining overall unity of design and function would influence urban planning theory and practice for centuries. The educational systems that had been developed to produce administrators and scholars who could function effectively across cultural boundaries would continue to influence the development of international education and cultural exchange. The idea that students should be exposed to multiple intellectual traditions and should be expected to understand and appreciate the wisdom of different civilizations would influence the development of liberal arts education and comparative studies in later centuries. The linguistic influences of Mongol rule can still be traced in languages from Korea to Hungary, where loanwords and grammatical structures reflect the historical influence of Mongol administration and cultural exchange. The artistic traditions that spread along the trade routes protected by Mongol rule continue to influence aesthetic development throughout Eurasia, while the musical and literary traditions that emerged from this period of cultural synthesis remain part of the cultural heritage of many contemporary societies. Perhaps most significantly, the Mongol Empire established precedents for thinking about governance and international relations on a truly global scale. The idea that a single governmental system could successfully administer territories spanning multiple continents and encompassing radically different cultural traditions was revolutionary in the 13th century and would continue to influence political theory and practice for centuries to come. The genetic legacy of Mongol expansion is also significant, with recent scientific studies suggesting that millions of people across Asia and Europe carry genetic markers that can be traced back to the Mongol conquests. This biological legacy is paralleled by cultural and linguistic influences that continue to shape the development of societies throughout the region that was once part of the Mongol Empire. The historical memory of Mongol rule continues to influence contemporary political and cultural discourse throughout the former territories of the empire. In Mongolia itself, Genghis Khan has become a powerful symbol of national identity and historical achievement, while in other regions the memory of Mongol rule is more complex and ambivalent, reflecting the diverse experiences of different populations under Mongol administration. The modern world's global networks of communication and trade, its cultural diversity and religious tolerance, its technological innovation and intellectual exchange, all bear the imprint of innovations and achievements that were first systematized under Mongol rule. While the political unity of the Mongol Empire could not be maintained indefinitely, its cultural and intellectual achievements continue to influence the development of human civilization in ways that are still being discovered and understood. As our long journey through the rise and transformation of the Mongol Empire draws toward its close, it is fitting that we return to the spiritual and philosophical foundations that gave this extraordinary civilization its distinctive character. The reverence for Tengri, the eternal blue sky, that had guided Genghis Khan and his successors was not merely a religious belief, but a profound worldview that emphasized the interconnectedness of all things and the responsibility of human beings to maintain harmony with the natural order. The shamanic traditions that had shaped the early development of Mongol culture emphasized the cyclical nature of existence, the constant interaction between the physical and spiritual worlds, and the understanding that power was not a permanent possession, but a temporary trust from the divine. These beliefs profoundly influenced the way Mongol rulers approached the challenges of governance, encouraging them to see themselves not as absolute autocrats, but as stewards of a cosmic order that transcended individual ambition. The concept of the mandate of heaven, that had been borrowed from Chinese political philosophy and adapted to Mongol beliefs, created a system of governance that was both pragmatic and idealistic. Mongol rulers understood that their authority depended not just on military strength, but on their ability to maintain the harmony and prosperity of their subjects. This understanding encouraged a form of governance that was responsive to the needs of diverse populations while maintaining the unity necessary for effective administration. The religious tolerance that had characterized Mongol rule from its inception reflected this deeper understanding of cosmic harmony. The Mongol belief that the divine could be approached through multiple paths encouraged a form of religious pluralism that was unprecedented in the medieval world. This tolerance was not merely a matter of practical convenience, but reflected a genuine philosophical commitment to the idea that different cultures and traditions could contribute to the overall harmony of the empire. The emphasis on practical results rather than traditional methods that characterized Mongol administration reflected their understanding that the natural world was constantly changing and that human institutions must be flexible enough to adapt to new circumstances. This pragmatic approach to governance encouraged innovation and experimentation in ways that would have lasting influence on the development of administrative and organizational theory. The connection between human society and the natural world that was central to Mongol spirituality influenced their approach to environmental stewardship in ways that were remarkably advanced for their time. The traditional nomadic lifestyle that had shaped Mongol culture emphasized the importance of maintaining the balance between human needs and natural resources, and this understanding influenced the way Mongol rulers approached the challenge of governing vast territories with diverse ecosystems. The cyclical understanding of history that was central to Mongol worldview encouraged a long-term perspective on political and social development that was unusual in the medieval world. Mongol rulers understood that empires rise and fall, that cultural traditions evolve and transform, and that the most important achievement was not the accumulation of power, but the creation of institutions and traditions that would continue to benefit humanity long after individual rulers had passed away. Today, as we face the challenges of globalization, environmental degradation, and cultural conflict, the wisdom of Mongol civilization offers valuable insights into the possibilities and limitations of human achievement. The Mongol Empire demonstrated that it was possible to create a truly global civilization that respected cultural diversity while maintaining political unity, that encouraged technological innovation while preserving traditional wisdom, and that promoted economic prosperity while maintaining environmental sustainability. The modern steppes of Mongolia, where traditional herders still follow ancient patterns of migration and seasonal movement, continue to embody the values and perspectives that once guided the greatest empire in human history. The wind that sweeps across these vast grasslands carries the same messages of change and continuity that once whispered to Genghis Khan and his successors, reminding us that human civilization is part of a larger cosmic order that demands both ambition and humility. As you prepare to rest and let sleep carry you into the realm of dreams, remember that the story of the Mongol Empire is not just a tale of conquest and achievement, but a meditation on the enduring human capacity to create meaning and purpose in the face of uncertainty and change. The eternal blue sky that watched over the rise and transformation of this extraordinary civilization continues to watch over us today, reminding us that we are part of the same great human story that produced Genghis Khan and his remarkable legacy. The patterns of migration and seasonal movement that continue to shape life on the Mongolian steppes reflect an understanding of natural rhythm and cosmic harmony that modern civilization has largely forgotten. The traditional herders who still follow these ancient patterns understand that survival depends not on conquering nature, but on learning to live in harmony with its cycles and seasons. This wisdom, which once guided the administration of the largest empire in human history, continues to offer valuable insights for contemporary challenges. In the contemplative hours before sleep, when the mind seeks patterns within the vast complexity of human experience, the complete arc of Genghis Khan's legacy reveals itself as something far more profound than mere conquest. His transformation from Temujin, the abandoned child scraping survival from the harsh steppes, to the architect of humanity's most expansive empire, illuminates the fundamental paradox of historical change, that the greatest revolutions often emerge not from the centers of established power, but from the margins, where necessity strips away illusion and forces the human spirit to discover its most essential capacities. The personal struggles that shaped his character, the early betrayals that taught him the value of loyalty, the periods of starvation that revealed the strength found in simplicity, the moments of isolation that forged his understanding of unity's precious nature. These intimate experiences became the foundation upon which he would build structures of governance that transcended anything previously imagined. Each childhood hardship was simultaneously a wound and a teacher, each early defeat a lesson in the patient accumulation of wisdom and power. The family relationships that sustained him throughout his extraordinary journey reveal the deeply human dimensions of historical transformation. Berte's unwavering partnership, surviving kidnapping and decades of separation, demonstrated that even the most ambitious imperial projects require the anchor of personal connection. The complex dynamics with his brothers, the painful rivalry with his blood brother Jamuka, the careful cultivation of loyalty among his generals. The individual choices that shaped the destiny of nations illuminate how personal character becomes collective destiny. When Genghis Khan chose merit over birth in selecting his administrators, when he established religious tolerance as imperial policy, when he protected merchants and scholars along the trade routes, he was not merely making pragmatic decisions, but expressing a worldview that had been forged in the crucible of his own experience of marginality and transformation. The modern steppes of Mongolia, where traditional herders still follow ancient patterns of migration beneath the same infinite sky that witnessed Temujin's birth, offer a meditation on the persistence of certain human values across the centuries. The grass that waves in patterns unchanged since the 13th century, the wind that carries the same messages it carried to shamans and khans, the seasonal rhythms that still govern nomadic life. These elements of continuity remind us that some aspects of human experience transcend the rise and fall of even the greatest empires. The lessons of impermanence and resilience embedded in this vast historical narrative speak to universal human experiences that echo across cultural and temporal boundaries. The struggle for identity in the face of overwhelming odds, the desire for unity amid seemingly irreconcilable differences, the challenge of balancing tradition with innovation. These themes find expression in every generation's attempt to create meaning and purpose within the broader human story. As consciousness prepares for its nightly journey into the realm of dreams, the the story of Genghis Khan offers a final, gentle reminder that each human life contains within it the same potential for transformation that once reshaped the known world. The capacity for vision, the courage to challenge existing limitations, the wisdom to learn from both triumph and failure. These qualities are not the exclusive province of historical figures, but the common inheritance of all who dare to imagine a better world and work toward its realization. In the vast silence that stretches across the Mongolian plateau, where the greatest story ever told began with a single breath drawn beneath the infinite blue sky, we find not an ending, but a beginning. The eternal promise that tomorrow will bring its own opportunities for courage, compassion, and creative vision, its own chance to contribute to the great work of civilization that continues in every human heart, that refuses to accept the limitations of circumstance.